Welcome to Haystacks in Hell, an Ex-Adventist podcast where we tell stories about growing up Seventh-day Adventist, leaving faith behind, and building new, fulfilling lives. Hey everyone, welcome back to Haystacks in Hell. I'm your host, Santiago, and today I'm very excited to speak with Matthew Vollmer. Matthew is a writer and professor of English at Virginia Tech, where he's also director of the school's MFA in Creative Writing program. His sixth and newest book, All of Us Together in the End, explores loss and transformation after the passing of his mother in 2019, followed by strange lights in the woods near his father's rural home. Matthew grew up in the mountains of southwestern North Carolina with deep Seventh-day Adventist roots. His grandparents met at boarding school, and so did his parents. His great-grandfather's medical diploma was signed by John Harvey Kellogg, and O.D. McKee, the Adventist man behind the Little Debbie Snacks brand, proposed to his grandma, but she turned him down. Even today, Matthew's family ties lead straight to the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, as Ted Wilson, the current GC president, is his uncle by marriage. As a kid, Matthew attended Sabbath school, loved Jesus, and got baptized on his 11th birthday in the cold waters of a mountain stream with friends and family singing, "Shall We Gather at the River?" He later attended Georgia Cumberland Academy, an SDA boarding school, and somewhere along the way, he stopped believing in the teachings of the Adventist Church. Today, Matthew lives in Blacksburg, Virginia with his wife and son, and as his latest book describes with vivid imagery, he's been on a journey to understand the mysterious lights that seemingly arrived just as his mother left this world. He's consulted with a retired geology professor, shamanic psychotherapist, Episcopalian clergy, and virtually anyone else who's been willing to listen. So with that background, let's jump into our conversation. Matthew, welcome. Thank you for your work, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Santiago. That was probably the best bio that I've ever heard. so great job with that. Very, very thorough and very accurate.
Glad to hear it. I did a lot of reading of your work, the book, some of your essays. No, I really appreciate it because you paint, at least in my mind, such vivid pictures of what your experiences were like with your family, with the environment you grew up in. And it's really almost like kind of a time capsule where I can picture some of these things that you're describing. You mentioned "Shall We Gather at the River?" That's one of the songs that we loved to sing in the youth Sabbath school that I taught. So that brought back some memories right there. And yeah, I really enjoyed your book. And the first question I want to start out with is, what made you decide to write this book? And had you been planning to write a family memoir for some time?
Yeah, actually, I had been writing it in some form or other. I mean, I have a journal that's completely filled with stuff about boarding school, and I called it Academy Days because Academy Days was actually the phrase that was used when you went to visit when you were an eighth grader.
Okay.
Like you would go and you would visit, the school that you intended to go to for a weekend and stay. You'd bring your sleeping bag and your suitcase and clothes and stuff. And the one thing I remember, literally the only thing I remember about Academy Days was that I stayed in a kid's room. And this is at Georgia Cumberland Academy. And one of the first things he said to me was, "Don't jack off in the sink," because every room had a sink. And I was mortified. I had never even, nobody had ever said that phrase to me in real life. And I was like, that's the last thing I'm going to do to you, man.
Oh man, what?
And it was just and that was just that was the tip of the iceberg of the kind of fucked up shit that happened there. But anyway, yeah, I have been trying to write about what it's been like to grow up Seventh-day Adventist, to be in a Seventh-day Adventist school. Back when I was doing my MFA at the University of Iowa, I got this idea that I was going to write a novel about a demon who was residing at a Seventh-day Adventist boarding school.
Oh my goodness.
Because he both longed to go back to heaven, but he also loved nothing more than to possess the bodies of Christian teenagers because they were so, like whenever they transgressed, they were like, they got off so much. And as an insensate being, he loved to be in the bodies of these kids as they were performing whatever transgressions they were performing, whether it was, eating beef jerky, drinking a Coke, or, engaging in physical intimacy. I mean, every person I've ever told about that novel idea is, oh, that's so great. It's such a wonderful idea. I just couldn't pull it off. It was just like, I don't know what it was about it. Like just it just screwed with my head. Like having an entity who had been alive since before human time, and then, whatever. So I shelved that, and I put my first book out, which is a collection of stories and has at least 3 stories where characters are encountering Seventh-day Adventists for the first time.
Okay.
Or non-Seventh-day Adventists and interacting with Adventists. And I thought that was a way for me to like kind of create empathy and curiosity. Like if I'm writing from an Adventist perspective, then that's a little bit burdensome. But if I'm writing about someone who just like goes to Atlantic Union College on a whim, but they don't know anything about Adventism, then they have all these things to negotiate and figure out. And so, I've written stories about Adventists. I've written essays about being an Adventist. And then I was like, you know what? I want to write a memoir about my time growing up and out of the church. Mm-hmm. And I wrote that memoir, and I delivered it to my agent in 2019, like 2 days before my mom died. And of course, I didn't know she was going to die. I knew she was about to die. I had no idea that, within 2 days she was, so. Mm-hmm. But after I had sent it to my agent, I'd also sent it to my colleague, Evan Lavender Smith, who's a professor here, or assistant professor here at Virginia Tech. And he said, I think this book really needs some revision. And my agent was like, do people really want to read about personal grief? Because it was also about my mom, like getting Alzheimer's. And I was like, dude, have you not read literature? But then the lights happened like 3 months later, and investigating the lights and having everything move towards COVID, and then my dad remarrying, that 3-act structure was exactly the structure I needed to kind of upload parts of the memoir into the storytelling of what was happening in real time. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, I appreciate the backstory there. I have to say, if and when you can get this novel of a demon possessing Adventist kids at boarding school, I'm sure virtually everybody listening right now would love to read that. I know I would. So do with that what you will.
I mean, I did all this research on demons and demonology. I bought a book called the Malleus Maleficarum. I may be butchering that name, but it was like a witch hunting guide circa 15th century, where it was basically like, if you don't believe in the devil, you don't believe in God, and you're a heretic. Mm-hmm. Or if you don't believe in witches, that means you don't believe in the devil, and that means you don't believe in God, and therefore you're a heretic, right? And they had some crazy stuff in there, like, witches are known to steal penises of men and put them in nests in trees. And someone who has lost their penis may come along and look in that nest and choose the largest one. I mean, it was,
what?
It was like, yeah, no, it is like so crazy what people were thinking that demons did. And
wow.
I mean, the imagination of folks back in the so-called dark ages or whatever you want to call them. I also bought like the entire comic collection, The Son of Satan, which was put out by Marvel and was like a Ghost Rider spinoff almost. Like Satan impregnates a woman, and the son of Satan is the son of Satan, but he's like a hero / anti-hero. Anyway, I'm just saying, like, I did all this. I did like tons of research on demons and Satan, and it was really fun and entertaining. And maybe it will end up happening at some point.
Yeah, no, I hope so. That sounds like a lot of research. Wow. As soon as I read your message, I immediately Googled you and came across your 2013 essay, This I Believed, which, by the way, highly recommend to everyone listening. It'll be linked in the show notes. And you wrote about getting baptized at 11 and feeling haunted by the fact that you didn't feel any different after coming up from the water. So I'm wondering if you can walk us through what you were thinking in that moment, if you remember.
Well, it was a big production. My grandfather was a physician in Asheville, North Carolina for many years. That's where my dad grew up. And my grandfather was also a major in World War II. He was a pacifist, and he helped liberate a prison camp. It was called Mauthausen, and was written about in a book called The Doctor and the Damned, which everyone in our family read and highlighted when Major Vollmer appeared on the pages. But anyway, they bought 100 acres of land that was bordering national forest, and it was very remote. Whenever I pictured the time of trouble, I always pictured us being in that part of the land and having to go even further into the mountains and hopefully find a cave where we could shelter. But there was a perfect little spot in the stream for a baptism. Not only was there like a little perfect spot in the stream, there was a rock shelf kind of just above the stream, and then across from that, a giant wooded boulder that he cleared and then put chairs on so people in the audience, so church members could be, and he made a staircase with stone steps going from the gravel road down to the wooded boulder that he cleared. And he built a fire on the rock shelf above the baptismal pool so that when I got out, I could like dry off. And it was just this huge production, right? And back then, the pastor, you had, I don't know if you were baptized. I assume you were baptized at some point.
I was.
I had weekly visits with our pastor for however many. I still have my baptismal study guide somewhere where there's a lesson each week on the 28 fundamental beliefs and little anecdotes and then questions do you give your heart to Jesus for all eternity? Do you forsake everything, stuff like that. But anyway, what I remember is that it was my birthday and I was turning 11. It was May 25. I'm a Gemini, which makes sense in this context because there's this duplicity, right? On the one hand, someone really wanting to do what they know is right, get baptized on your 11th birthday, follow Jesus into eternity, and then the other person saying why did nothing spectacular actually happen after I was raised up, right? And I don't know what I was expecting, but I just felt, I guess I was hoping to feel some sort of palpable transformation, and that didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, there was a little bit of disappointment. I'm sure that, opening my birthday presents, I seem to remember getting some G.I. Joes or something, might have, assuaged that to some degree. But I think that could have been a seed for me in terms of wait, maybe everything I've been told isn't, not that anyone even told me that I would feel this transformation, but I just expected that because it was such a big, supposedly big moment. Yeah. And it's funny because yesterday, my nephew, my sister's youngest son, got baptized. I would love to have a conversation with him because he is a character. He's such an interesting person. To give you a glimpse into his brain, which is highly imaginative, he said that when he died, he wanted his ashes to be combined with bubble gum and put on the underside of a Steak and Shake table.
Wow, that did not go where I was expecting it to.
Exactly. I mean, I wonder about these kids growing up now in the church, like, because you have to tell yourself stories in order to remain in any sort of religious denomination. I wonder what they're telling themselves. I wonder what he felt afterwards. And if it's all great, that's fine. I don't need to deconvert every single person from Adventism. But I also understand that there are many, many people who do need to do that, and it's very hard.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. We were talking before we started recording about, Abby and Amy and their original podcast. Abby, at one point, she left in her 30s, and she talks about having this conflict of wondering, would her parents in, their late 60s, I think by that point, would they have been happier, or would they be happier if they could leave, with the rest of their life, however much time they have left, would it be happier if they could leave? And she was very torn thinking about this, because on the one hand, they've dedicated so much time and emotional energy and money into the church, and all of their friends are in it. But on the other hand, she sees different ways in which maybe they genuinely could be happier. And she was kind of struggling. Do I talk to them? Do I tell them, hey, there's more to the world.
A whole new world.
Yeah, exactly. So, I feel that because you've written about how, witnessing the decline of somebody you love so much with dementia, right, with Alzheimer's. I've experienced that with both of my grandmothers. I was younger when it happened with the grandmother on my dad's side. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. My grandma on my mom's side has been diagnosed with dementia. And just over the last number of years, just like you described your mom, a strong person who's just this force of nature and who has done so much in their life, and, the family's kind of gels around them. Seeing that transformation with my grandmother has definitely been difficult. And I've heard my own mom, who is very strong in her faith, she's wondered, she's like, why is this happening to my mother? Why is this happening to my mother? And what does this mean? What do I make of this? And I think many of us growing up in Adventism, and I think within Christianity and faith in general, we sometimes think that there has to be a meaning behind some of these things when maybe there isn't. I think different people might take different perspectives on that, but my view now is we don't have to assign meaning to every single thing.
Oh, absolutely. I keep coming back to the epigraph in my book, which is from Karen Armstrong's A Case for God, where she talks about the scientist Karl Popper saying that the most profound thing a human being can say is that I know nothing. And I think about how many of the world's problems exist because someone thinks they know something for sure.
Yeah.
If we had a little bit more humility, if we really did say, well, I know nothing, how much more peaceful kind of people would we be? Because then we'd be better listeners, we'd be better thinkers.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Before we go kind of forward in time into your story, I want to ask you what it was like, as you've described it, growing up in the middle of nowhere.
Okay, well, I did grow up in the middle of nowhere. I grew up in a cove, in a house on a little hill above two streams that came together at the bottom. And there wasn't a lot to do. I wasn't an outdoors person. I knew kids who, could spend all day in the woods. That wasn't me. I loved to be in my bedroom, like where I could be for hours, building Legos, drawing, recording things on tape, then recording films once we got a camcorder in our basement. We spent a lot of time in our basement, my sister and I. And apparently it was also, after we left, like tested for radon, and like the radon levels in the basement were 500 times what they should have been.
Oh, no.
So I'm just waiting. Either I became superhuman or like the hammer is just going to come down at some point. My dad being a dentist in a very small community. I mean, the size of Andrews, North Carolina is 1,600 people, and it was 1,600 people 40 years ago. And I went to a church school 20 minutes away in Murphy, North Carolina. It was an A-frame, 3-level church school, grades 1 through 4 on one floor, grades 5 through 8 on the next, library at the top. And, we had carpool. We met every morning in a parking lot, and somebody drove us there and somebody picked us up. So I didn't know any kids, or I knew very few kids in my town unless they went to my church or my school. So it was like weirdly isolating. Like I didn't ever feel at home in my hometown, because if I had reason to go there, like we were a mile from town, and I would sometimes ride my bike into town once I got old enough. But I always felt conspicuous. I always felt like I didn't know who people were, and I knew that it was such a close-knit community that people might be wondering who I was, or who would be like, oh, that's Doc's son, because my dad was known as Doc, as being a dentist. So yeah, I felt like an outsider, which I was, basically raised to be, right? Like, this world is not your home. Like, non-Adventist society is not your home. I kind of remember like being in church and like looking out the window and seeing someone mow their yard, or like, it kind of longed for like what would it be like to just have a Saturday where I was a regular person, where I got to wake up and, turn on Saturday morning cartoons, which I never got to see.
Same.
I remember 2 times that I got to see Saturday morning cartoons. We were delivering food to a poor family one Saturday morning, and they had the TV on, and we stopped by, we gave the food, covering my eyes, but also like looking through the and then like picking up my friend John Ringhofer, who's a musician who makes like Christian psych pop as Half-Handed Cloud. You should look him up at some point, because he's also a former Adventist and very Christian. He got into the church because one of the friends of our family was dating his mom, and the friends of our family he was a church member. And so at some point we picked him up, and he hadn't been indoctrinated enough to know that he shouldn't watch cartoons on Saturday morning. So I went in to get him, and he was like watching Transformers or something, and like putting on his shoes. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you're watching cartoons. So yeah, I mean, I think of that house that I grew up in as a kind of incubator for creativity, because I didn't have anywhere else to go. And I loved watching TV, although I only got to watch a limited portion of it. But, like I knew about the world outside, and I couldn't wait to get there. My mom's family was in Greenville, South Carolina, which is a 3-hour drive away. And to me, that was like, it might as well have been New York City. I mean, just because, they had movie theaters and ice cream stores, and they had toy stores and malls, and a downtown with, quasi skyscrapers and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I was although I grew up in a loving family environment, like as much as I couldn't wait for Sabbath to be over and to be able to turn the TV on again, I absolutely loved Friday night, the whole kind of like Friday night tradition of tuning out the secular world and welcoming the Sabbath. I talk about it in the book, about how there was this whole, just this really comforting ritual of, especially in the winter months, when my dad would like lay a fire, and we would, light candles, and we would have these simple suppers, could be haystacks, could be what we called beans on bread, which were just like cooked navy beans on toast, And lentil tostadas was another one, which was like a slice of bread with mayonnaise and then lentils, cheese. It was like kind of a haystack. Lentils, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes. There's a really good recipe that I use now whenever I make it using naan and then avocado, like mashed up avocado on the naan, and then lentils, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, cucumber, sriracha, and ranch.
That does sound pretty good.
That hits.
I'm going to have to try that at some point.
Yeah, it's good. It's really good.
So as I'm hearing you share your story, it sounds like there was some tension between the beliefs you were raised to have and also seeing the outside world and wanting to go see what that was like. And I'm wondering, did you ever like really question what you were taught at home, school, or church, or was that something that came later on?
Well, I think what was interesting thinking about this for me as a kid, like I associated my dad's side with being rather conservative. They were vegetarian, completely vegetarian. They didn't drink coffee or soda. And it's funny because I see my mom as being more conservative than my dad. I see my dad being more liberal than my mom, but his side of the family was more conservative. My mom's family, we would go there at Christmas. My grandma would make roast beef. They made a big deal about drinking coffee. It was always like, oh, who wants coffee? My grandfather, who was a real character, when he was 3 years old, he put his hand on a chopping block where his older 6-year-old sister was cutting wood on. And she said, if you don't move your hand, I'm going to lower this axe. And he didn't move his hand, and she lowered the axe and cut off his middle ring finger and pinky on his left hand. His mother, Pansy, buried them in a matchbox underneath a sycamore tree. And he went on to become like this amazing person who, I think because of his handicap, was interested in proving himself. Like in all of his stories, he was the smaller guy who beat up the bigger guy. He was hiding his hand in dental school so that no one would know that he only had, that he didn't have all of his fingers. But anyway, he was also like really into movies. And as a kid, he was a hard worker, and he would like save up every week so he could go to the movie theater and watch Westerns. He'd buy his Hershey bar, go into the theater, and watch whatever it was, right? He was a huge Zane Grey fan. He was a very popular, probably the most popular writer in America in the 1920s and 30s. He was a writer of Westerns. He was also a former dentist. Dentists show up everywhere in my family. So anyway, like there was this, like I mistrusted the conservative side and I trusted the liberal side because I was like, it makes sense that we should go to movies, right? It makes sense that we could drink coffee or eat meat if we wanted it. Like, why would this be a bad thing, right? I kind of resented like the ways in which certain members of my family on my dad's side operated, i.e. my Uncle Ted. It's funny because like Ted's father was also the GC president for many years. And my dad tells a story about Ted would show up at our house, right? And it would be like Friday night. And he would just be like, okay, everyone, gather around. It's time for worship. And he would open up like a devotional book and read out of it. And we'd have prayer, we'd sing, whatever. And I would just be like, dude, like, that's not what we do here. This is not how we roll. Like, why are you inflicting your, like, why are you just assuming that this is how like obligatory worship happens? Even in my young mind, like that's how I was reading it. And when I told my dad that once, he was like, oh, well, when Neil Wilson, Ted's father, came to visit one time, he did the same thing. And as a 3-year-old, you said, what's worship? And my dad was like super embarrassed. I just find that really tickles me to think about, like, my 3-year-old being like, "What's worship?"
So you've got the GC president in your home, and 3-year-old you is what's worship.
Yeah.
Amazing. Oh man. Well, so speaking of kind of, your own family practices around worship, many ex-Adventists describe growing up really stressed out on Sabbath mornings, and that's something that I can personally relate to. But reading your book, reading some of your other work, you've described having parents who were seemingly perfect, almost maybe too perfect. So I'm wondering, what were Sabbath mornings like for you and your family?
Well, Sabbath mornings always felt like an extension of Friday night in a way. Like at Friday night dinner, we always had like some sort of special dessert, like sweet roll. Like we had this thing called Schnecken, which is apparently that word means snail in German, but it's like a cinnamon bun. It's like a twisty cinnamon bun. And my mom and my dad's mom were really good at making this stuff. We would probably have like Schnecken after our dinner on Friday night, but then the next morning we would have Schnecken for breakfast as well. So we would always have like a special Sabbath breakfast, and then we would go to church, go to Sabbath school and church. And my mom was the pianist, so we always like sat on the third row all the way on the left side so she could have easy access to the piano. My dad was a deacon, so he would often be called to do the offertory, and we make fun of him to this day because like he could never get through it without his like eyes tearing up and becoming watery. so sentimental. But he was also like the first guy, like if the church phone rang like in the fellowship hall, he would just be leaping up and running towards it to get it, or like if it was time for Mission Spotlight, right? Which is, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Mission Spotlight, but he would be the first one to get up and turn the lights off, to help out. And so my parents are very involved in the church. My mom ran the fruit program. She volunteered to sell Florida citrus to townspeople to raise money for our church school. And she did that for years. And so, she was known in town as like the fruit lady. And then we'd go home after. We always stopped at the post office on the way home to get the mail. And my dad, as a dentist, the mail was always a huge thing because it was coming from the outside world. And he had all these subscriptions to magazines for his waiting room. And so who knew what would be coming in the mail? And this is back when the mail was like actually interesting. You get catalogs, you'd get Sports Illustrated, you get People Magazine, Time Magazine, National Geographic. It was like the mail used to be the internet.
Right. Before it just became a bunch of like coupons and and like just ads basically.
Like stuff that you just take from your mailbox to the recycling bin.
Honestly, that is what I do like 90% of the time.
But anyway, so we'd stop by the post office, get the mail, then we'd go home, and my mom would have like a huge meal prepared. We would usually have people over, whether they were visiting or just people from church. Vegetarian meatballs, mashed potatoes, creamed corn, green beans or broccoli. I don't know if this was a thing for you growing up, but we had like, and we didn't call them this, but mocktails. Not cocktails, but mocktails, like 7-Up with, some juice in it or something, like on ice. And we had like these, we would keep these, my mom always kept these glasses in the freezer so they'd be real ice cold. And sometimes it'd even be like sparkling, non-alcoholic apple juice or something, right?
Martinelli.
Yeah. Everything was like, it was this huge spread. And then afterwards it'd be some like extravagant dessert. Whether it was like hot fudge sundaes with homemade chocolate sauce or some sort of cake or pie. I don't know if that's been your experience too in Adventist circles. Like you go to potluck and you get all these great casseroles, but there's also like a huge dessert spread.
I'm sure it varies from church to church. I know that sometimes it kind of depended on the week and who brought food. But yeah, I remember some really good food at the church I grew up in. I do remember at one point we did start to have a specific dessert section, and some people who were very into being vegan would make vegan desserts and bring those, and they would be called out specifically as being vegan. So yeah, I do remember a little bit about that, but the picture that you're painting for me is one that it sounds like Friday night, Sabbath afternoon, Sabbath morning, even with breakfast. It was definitely almost kind of this special ritual that your family had, where there's this huge spread, and it's truly sounds like it was a special moment for you growing up.
Absolutely. And the funny thing, and I would think about this sometimes as a kid, I think, we'd come home from church, we do this like really intensive like church service where it's like the whole time you're feeling like, oh my God, I need to be going door to door to tell people that Jesus is coming. And then you just go home like it's a regular thing. I mean, like you don't do anything about it. Like you say a prayer, but nothing is about church. Nothing is about the Bible. Nothing is like the conversations are just like, you're just sitting there listening mostly to men talk about life and share like funny stories. I think that is one thing about growing up Adventist is that you do have a lot of funny stories, because no matter who you are is like so quirky and idiosyncratic and in conflict with like regular life, right? Or, people would talk. I mean, my mom was talking about like having to sneak away from Southern Missionary College, which is what it's called back in the day, Southern Adventist University now in Collegedale, sneaking away to go to see The Sound of Music and worrying because there was people at the school. If you went to that school, you had to have a special sticker on your car that would allow you to park there without getting like fined.
Okay.
So people from the school would go to the movie theater parking lot and to check if people were actually from SMU were there in attendance.
Wow.
And then they would figure out.
Wow.
That is some deeply pathological shit right there, right?
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
I mean, they would tell stories about Adventism, they'd tell stories about non-Adventism, they would tell, so like the meal was just like this, it was this set piece of like, we're going to hear some stories, we're going to eat some good food, we're going to have dessert, and then later on, the adults are probably going to take naps, and or maybe we'll go for a hike. And then it was just like that, however many hours from mid-afternoon to when the sun actually went down, just both waiting for Sabbath to end, but then like feeling guilty because you were waiting for the Sabbath to end because you're supposed to guard the edges of the Sabbath, right? And trying to find things to do, like, oh, if we can't swim, can we wade? If we can't play basketball, can we play like a version of horse that's like, Moses or Jesus?
I can relate to that feeling of wanting the Sabbath to end, but also feeling guilty. And I've heard other ex-Adventists talk about that as well. Definitely, I think, a common thread for many people. So within all of this, I'm wondering, did you experience moments that to you as a kid felt spiritual or supernatural?
Not at all. And I longed for that. I mean, that was, there's a character in Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. I don't know if you're familiar with that story or ever read it. The main character is a grandmother who doesn't want to go to Florida and is trying to convince her children, her son and their kids and his wife, not to go, but she ends up going with them. And part of the reason she doesn't want to go is because there's a criminal named the Misfit, a loose. And the Misfit has escaped with some other people from prison. And of course, they end up running into him, and he ends up executing the entire family one at a time. And he executes the grandmother last. Part of his conversation when he's talking to her is like, I wish I had been there when Jesus was alive, so then I would know if he was real or not. How come I didn't get to live at that time? How come I didn't get to see that? Having heard all of the stories of miracles throughout the Old and New Testament, and just being like, wow, how much easier would it be for me to just like accept everything if I had seen someone turn water into wine, if I had seen Elijah go to heaven in a flaming chariot. Name a miracle. Like name a supernatural event in the Bible. Like, why can't I see this? And so yeah, I didn't have any experience with that, but I did long for it for sure.
I can relate to that. The one time I experienced something that I thought could be supernatural was a prayer I said for a friend who was going through some tough times. And I prayed what, looking back now, is actually kind of a generic prayer, which is, God, please protect them, make them feel like they're okay, send 2 angels to be with them, and because they were feeling like they were potentially in danger in that moment. And the next morning I get a text message from my friend saying, thank you for praying for me. I don't remember exactly what the text said, but it was something along the lines of they either dreamed or felt like they saw or felt the presence of 2 angels around them.
Oh,
and for
wow.
me, when I read that text message, I had goosebumps on my arms. And I remember telling it to the kids in my youth class, and I remember telling it to people in Pathfinders. And for me, I hadn't had an experience like that up until that point when I was a young adult. And at that point, I was very spiritual, trying to lean in more into my spirituality because I'm going through young adulthood. I'm trying to figure out who I am as a young adult in the world and trying to figure out my own identity as a person separate from kind of everything that was taught to me.
Now that I think about it, I do remember I had like I had like a prayer journal. I mean, then I had started like half-heartedly. There was probably like 2 entries in it, but like I lost my wallet at school, and then I prayed to find it, and I found it. So it was like prayer, please let me find my wallet. Result, wallet found. But then there was also, I think I mentioned this in the book, there was an instance when I was older where I hydroplaned on a wet road with my friend and went 360 degrees. It was a 4-lane road with like a turning lane in the middle, and we were spinning into the other oncoming traffic. I saw a semi. I thought there's no way it's not going to hit us, and somehow we spun right into the middle, the safest place possible, which is the middle turning lane, going the direction that we'd been going in at the beginning. And I was like, that was a miracle. And in fact, that was probably the first thing I ever published, because I sent it off to Insight magazine. And they published it. Part of the thing was I was talking about the story about, and you may have heard this because I heard it so many times when I was growing up. There was an old woman and she's sickly and there's a snowstorm and her fire's gone out and she's going to freeze to death. And then suddenly someone appears at her door with an armload of logs and starts the fire and makes sure she's okay, and then leaves. And she gets up to go look, and there's no footprints in the snow. So it must have been an angel. I was like, well, if it's snowing, it's probably going to cover up the footprints. But anyway, I had always kind of, made fun of that in my head. And then I was like, oh, well, now you had a real experience of divine intervention, right? And even though I wasn't sure, I think writing that was like a way for me to hope that I did believe in it, if that makes sense. Like writing that was actually like a prayer, like, let this be true, because I really did. I mean, if you grew up Adventist, and if you're a 4th, 5th generation Adventist from both sides, like the thing that you want is to believe and to be able to assimilate, because everyone else is. And when you can't, and when you don't, real conflicts arise.
I can imagine. And I definitely want to ask you about that in a bit. Before we get there, though, I want to ask you about the time of trouble, because you've written about believing in that and how even though you already lived in the mountains, you knew that you would have to flee your home, as authorities would know where all the Sabbath keepers lived and they would hunt you down. So I'm wondering, how often was that idea brought up in your church, and did you have anxiety about this or the afterlife?
This was like probably one of my biggest worries growing up. First of all, I never thought of myself as a good Adventist. I never said like, oh, I'm doing the right thing. I never read my Bible in a year. Every year I was like, that was my New Year's resolution. You're going to read the Bible from beginning to end. I never, shared my beliefs with anyone who didn't ask for me to. I wasn't going door to door. I wasn't like, I loved the pageantry of the NFL and collecting football cards and, dreaming about that. And my mom would get on me and say, like, you need to be spending more time with your Bible. You spend too much time with your football cards and I would feel guilty. And I'd be like, yeah, I probably should, but this is so much more interesting. I loved Mad Magazine and Cracked Magazine and comic books, and not that I was ever allowed to actually buy them, and G.I. Joe and like Looney Tunes and Bugs Bunny. But then I was like, oh, well, yeah, I should be this kind of person, right? But there was also a disconnect because, like, as much as we, spent time in church, we weren't like a super religious family. Like my mom got up every morning and read like the Spirit of Prophecy, or her Bible to start her day. And it's a funny anecdote about that is like my dad had had wanted to do that for many years. And like when he might have been in his 50s or something. And he was like, you know what? If I'm going to do this, I need to get up at like 5 a.m. before I go to my job. So he asked, his prayer that night was, please wake me up at 5 a.m. so that I can do this. And he woke up at 5 a.m. like that's the kind of stuff, right? Anyway, time of trouble. Yes, it was very real. I imagined it all the time. I worried about it. I read, there were books. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. There's like these novelizations of the time of trouble that Adventist publishing houses made. Like those are the only fiction that I knew of growing up was like the Song of Eve. I should probably look this up. So June Strong is the novelist, right? Oh, Project Sunlight. That's what it was. So Project Sunlight was this book about a woman who converts to Adventism during the end times. And then the time of trouble happens, and then, all that stuff moves forward. But she also wrote a song called Song of Eve, which is like it was about Eve, but like after she'd been expelled from the garden and before the flood happens. That's just to say that like whatever representation we had, whether it was in a sermon or a novelization or whatever, like the time of trouble was very much like on my mind. If I complained about something, my grandma would say like, you need to go read the chapter on the time of trouble. And then that, in the Great Controversy, that's like probably the only chapter I've ever read. Well, that's not true, but it's definitely the one I've read the most because it's so dramatic and it's speculative fiction is what it is. But it was harrowing. And I was like, oh, I need to, I should memorize more of my Bible because, in the time of trouble, we're going to be hiding in a cave. We won't have our Bibles and we'll need to sing hymns and recite memory verses to keep our spirits up. And, it was just like this huge, I didn't pray this directly to God, but I would just think like, please God, make the time of trouble be like after I'm dead. Back in the 1980s, we thought like, oh, Jesus is going to be here in 5 years. But I was like, wait, I haven't even kissed a girl. I haven't, I want to like have a family. I want to get married. I want to like do all these things before I go to heaven and like live a sexless life for eternity.
It's funny you mentioned that because I had that same exact thought. I was like, you know what? I want Jesus to come back soon, but not until after I've had sex with somebody because we won't be able to get to do that in heaven. So I'm sure there's other people who have had that same thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny because it's like, well, if it was actually heaven, like, wouldn't whatever you were doing be better than sex? Right?
True.
But yeah, that's probably a universal thought among honest Adventists.
Yeah.
And ex-Adventists.
I'm sure. I'm sure. When it's funny you mentioned the 80s because I am in the middle of listening to the audiobook from Bart Ehrman. I think it's his latest book called Armageddon.
That guy's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and it would be a dream come true if I could happen to get him on the podcast because his book, How Jesus Became God, was instrumental in my own personal journey of deconstruction and deconversion. And he mentions in his book a man named Hal Lindsey, which I had not heard of before. But he talks about how
the late great Planet Earth.
Yeah, exactly. And he talks about how Hal Lindsey predicted that the Earth was going to end in 1980, 85? In any case, he predicted that the world was going to end in the 1980s. And apparently, Ronald Reagan bought into this view. A bunch of other politicians, people in the UK, bought into that view. And it's just fascinating how the book of Revelation has been used by people from all walks of life for all sorts of different purposes. But this idea that Revelation is foretelling the future of planet Earth is actually a somewhat recent interpretation of that book. So for anyone who hasn't read Bart Ehrman before or who is interested in eschatology and in understanding what a non-dogmatic modern Bible scholar has to say about this book, definitely check it out. It's going to be linked in the show notes, of course, along with Matthew's book and some of the other essays and work that we've been mentioning on the podcast. But yeah, fascinating stuff. Still working my way through it, but it's so interesting to see how entire movements like the Adventist movement came up from certain specific interpretations of this book, which, by the way, early Christians debated on whether it should even be included in the biblical canon. It wasn't always a sure thing that this book was going to be in the canon.
The funny thing to me is, if you think about the Adventist Church and the way that they try to put together this linear timeline that is like has all these unimpeachable events that happened, and this verse talks about this verse. I mean, you when you hear a sermon, you're always ping-ponging back and forth through the Bible, right? You're never like looking at one book at a time and asking like, what context was this written, or what, And so to start understanding the Bible as an anthology that had a lot of different writers, but also that the Jewish people, how they interact even today with the Hebrew Bible is midrash, right? It's arguing about what these, like the text is a living thing, and to interact with it is to have these different perspectives. Like that's the whole point, is to like try to like, have a conversation about what the possible meanings could be. And the idea that would happen in an Adventist church is like, I don't know, it just doesn't, it seems highly unlikely. I mean, maybe the closest thing you get is Sabbath school. And then someone's like, someone in adult Sabbath school is questioning one part of like the sanctuary doctrine, right? And then like people are talking about that later, like, can you believe they don't believe in the sanctuary doctrine or whatever? like these idiosyncratic, beliefs and interpretations that are like absolutely you have to believe in order to be a member. And it makes me think of, there's other books too that I think I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Enns, ENNS. He has a book called The Bible Tells Me So, Why Defending Scripture Has Made Us Unable to Read It. That's a really good one. And also the work of John Shelby Spong, who was an Anglican minister for many years. He has books called like The Sins of Scripture, or Why Christianity Must Change or Die. And there's a lot of really interesting deconstruction going into that. I mean, especially he was a practicing Episcopal priest who basically was like, we have to acknowledge that the Bible is a book of myths, and that myths have the power to, be vehicles for meaning and for how we can understand the human condition. But imagining that Noah had all of the earth's creatures in his ark represented in there that's not the point of the story.
Right, right. Or even the creation myth, which
Oh, yeah.
the Adventist Church, not everybody, but I would argue, at least in my own experience and observations, the vast majority of Bible believing Adventists hold to young earth creationism. And I was an ex-Adventist in my late 20s by the time I found out that there were early Christians who understood Genesis to not be a literal 6-day creation. And there were early Christian theologians who were well respected. They weren't considered heretics, who also held this view. And I'm learning so much now that I've left. I like we were talking about before we started recording. I've learned so much more about Adventism and Christianity since leaving.
Yeah.
It is fascinating. And just to find out that, yeah, the biblical literalism that has taken the United States and evangelical Christianity as a whole by storm is a relatively new invention. And it's not the
Absolutely.
way Christians always read Scripture.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
I mean, it was one thing that opened my eyes was just reading more widely, right? Like, I remember reading the Tao Te Ching as an undergraduate and just thinking, like, wow, like, this is actually a text that is saying true things, right? Like, there are, like, other religions, other spiritualities, other philosophies, there is truth in there, right? And I can read a John Donne poem or a John Donne sermon from the 17th century and realize that it's richer, it's more textured, it's more intellectual than anything that the Adventist Church has ever produced, or especially Ellen White, right? Who I always disliked. I felt like I was being lectured by like a 19th century schoolmarm, and I felt guilty, like I was like, oh, like everyone was like, oh, if you just read, like I got given this book, leather bound with my name in gold on it, Steps to Christ, right? If you just read Steps to Christ, like you'll really just understand. And I would like open up and I was like, this is boring as shit, dude. I mean, this is just, it sucks. Like the voice sucks. And then I would like just have to deny that I had that reaction and put it down and, find something else to do because I couldn't deal with the knowledge that I wasn't, living up to what I should be or do.
I think Ellen White has definitely become less of a focus for many churches in North America in the past couple of decades. I grew up in a church that was definitely fundamentalist and conservative, and Ellen White was quoted from the pulpit, I would say, fairly regularly. But even then, and probably a lot of that has to do with the fact that I grew up on the West Coast, but I did not get nearly as much, or at least I felt like I didn't get nearly as much of the lecturing from Ellen White. And, I do remember from some older Adventists who were involved in Pathfinders, I do remember getting talked to about swimming on the Sabbath at one point. That was, I think, the first and last time because nobody ever else was talking about this. So these were old school Adventists, I guess. And I do remember getting scolded one time. We were at Oshkosh for the International Camporee, and we were playing football, just kind of throwing a football around. And some staff member from another club came over to scold us for throwing a football around on Sabbath. But, I did not grow up marinated in that like some other people did. So it's so interesting to see how it shifted over time. And I think that's probably, to the consternation of some folks.
Yeah, one of the things that I think about now is how I wouldn't have dreamed of turning on the TV as a kid. In fact, I once did turn on the TV. I remember my mom was like getting ready. My parents were getting ready. I guess my sister was getting ready in her room. I was alone in the living room. And it was one of those old school TVs where you pull a knob out and then the TV gradually comes on. And I just pulled it out. And before even this picture could like bloom into view, I quickly shut it off. I was like, oh my gosh, I almost did something really bad, and now, and in fact, like once when I was at my grandparents' house, my uncle and I went downstairs. I was probably like 12 to watch a UNC Tar Heels basketball game because it was like March Madness or whatever, right? And my dad walks in, and it was like, uh-oh. And he was like, you know what? You're going to have to talk to the pastor. Like on our ride home, he's like, we're going to set up an appointment for you to talk to the pastor, which he never did. But I remember being really, really scared and freaked out about that. And now, like, my dad's on his iPad all day, like watching videos and like, like Fox News or whatever. I mean, like, and my sister's kids are on their phones watching stuff. And it's like everybody carries a baby TV in their pocket now. They can just access it whenever they want. It's not a big deal. So things really have changed.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about this more in a bit, but the internet, I think, has thrown every institution for a loop. It has thrown society for a loop. I've talked about how I think we got the internet before we were ready for it, but then again, when are you ever truly ready for technological change? Like the AI revolution is happening right now. It is incredible to see. And whenever I'm feeling particularly cynical about the news of the day, I just have to remind myself, I'm like, hey, this much interesting stuff has happened in the short span of my life. How much more interesting, possibly horrible, likely horrible, but also interesting stuff is going to happen by the time I'm in my 50s, 60s, 70s. Like that thought is one of the things that keeps me going when things are looking particularly bleak. But yeah, I mean, we're going to come back to the internet because I think it's been the deconstruction movement would not be happening, in my opinion, without the internet.
Right.
TikTok and Instagram, social media in general, this podcast, right?
Right.
Just so many things are possible because of the internet, and it's fascinating to watch in real time. But I want to bring us back a little bit because you've written about attending an Adventist boarding school and living in the dorms, and I was laughing out loud at the part where you mentioned shooting bleach-filled squirt guns at each other. So I want to ask you, what were some of your best and worst experiences at Georgia Cumberland Academy?
Oh, man. I mean, the best experience, I might as well preface it by saying, like, I always knew I was going to go. Right. I can't remember a time when I didn't know that I was going to boarding academy of some kind. Like my parents met at boarding. Well, they didn't meet it. They met before boarding school, but they got together in boarding school and they'd been together since then. My grandmother on my mom's side had an accidental encounter with someone who put her in touch with President Harding's sister, who had married an Adventist or something. And so I don't know if she was working for her or if I can't remember how the story goes, but anyway, she was sent to the school where my grandfather went. She walked in during some sort of President's Day thing that was happening in the chapel, and my grandpa saw her for the first time, and he was like, oh, that's the one. So there was all this lore behind like people getting together, finding your true love. And that was what I was most important. I was girl crazy as a 14-year-old, and the main thing I wanted to do was have a girlfriend. And I knew it wasn't going to happen in my school of 30 kids in grades 1 through 8. And so I was ecstatic to go, and it was really fun. I was really into basketball, and so we had outdoor courts, we had a gymnasium, we had an intramural league, 2 different intramural leagues. So like just being around other boys, and being with your friends just day in and day out, right? Like I talk about in the book, like we had no idea what was going on outside the school, and we didn't care. We were like, oh, it sucks that we can't watch TV or listen to radios without, getting them confiscated or whatever, or dance or eat meat or wear jewelry or, wear T-shirts of our favorite bands or whatever. There was all these rules, but we were still with our friends, at the end of the day, I just remember having like deep, heartfelt conversations with my roommates, as we're drifting off. And also like the amount of singing that we did. Like there were really beautiful songs that we sang. I was in choir one year, but we got up every morning and went to chapel and we sang, to start the day. And we had this thing called Afterglow after Vespers. So we would have a Vespers service where we'd have a song service, where you have a speaker, whether it's invited speaker or someone from our school. And then we would sing again to end the service. And then you could go back to your dorm or you could go to Afterglow. And Afterglow was walking down the academy driveway to the sign and singing stuff like Pass It On, Under the Stars, Meet Me in Heaven. And that was as close to a transformative, transcendent spiritual experience that I've probably ever had in my life. To be standing out there with my friends in a circle, holding hands, staring up at the stars and singing about, I hope that we'll all meet each other in heaven someday, right? Those were the good parts. Meeting, I have friends that I've met in Academy. I would say probably 85% of the people that I met there are no longer Adventists. But we can all have, it wouldn't matter if we hadn't talked in 40 more years. Like as soon as we can pick up our conversations where we left off. And I think that was something that was really, I've talked about it as like a hostage situation. like you form these bonds with people because like you're all hostages.
You're trauma bonding in the dorms.
Exactly. But it was actually more than that, because we did have real friendships that were deep and complicated and nuanced. And raising a son who was in public school and had a very secular, by design, raising. He had a very great childhood and a pretty good adolescence until COVID. But I just don't think that he had those experiences. I mean, he had lots of friends, but being trapped in a dorm every night from lights out at 10:30 or whatever it was to when you get up at 6 to go to the showers, you're like showering with your friends, like there's no stalls. You're just like bunch of dudes. It's all hanging out, and we got used to it and it wasn't a problem. I mean, like, and, so there were all these bonds formed, but then it was like, yeah, it was like truly fucked up because there was lots of hazing. There were fights. There were, wrestling matches gone awry. This kid, Jeremy Newland, God bless him. He was like this cool skater dude who I looked up to. We got into a impromptu wrestling match and he like, not only did he win, but he like took it further by taking the band of my Fruit of the Looms and yanking it all the way over my head and shoulder.
Oh no.
And there was like a group of guys watching, right? And so like I remember like I probably ended up in tears, not because of the pain, but of like just the emotional distress of like, how could someone I look up to do this to me with impunity, And then there were just like, like relationships and falling in love with, I was always like in love with some girl who at least until the very, my senior year was like, it wasn't ever mutual. Or it was, if it was like complicated in some weird way.
I can relate to that.
Yeah.
But not within a boarding school context, but yes, I can relate to that.
I have a story in my collection, This World Is Not Your Home, called How to Write a Love Story. I don't know if you've read that one, but it's all about boarding school, and it's about wooing this Korean-American girl who had never had a boyfriend and who was like very proud of that fact. Like, I don't need a boyfriend. I'm not interested in dating. Boys only want one thing, blah, blah, blah. And who thought that I was an airhead and that I just relentlessly pursued her. And we ended up losing our virginity on senior class trip on a beach in the Bahamas.
Oh, wow.
which, people would say, like, if they didn't know Adventist, they'd think, wow, what an amazing place to, like, lose your virginity. Right? But, like, as soon as it happened, the first thing that came to my mind was, like, now I know how Adam and Eve felt in the Garden of Eden. That was literally the first thought that came to my mind.
Wow.
And it was like, it was really fucked up because we had no way of dealing with it, right? Like we had begun to be physical when we could, and we knew that there would be, unsupervised situations, and we actually promised each other, like, we're not going to do this. We're not going to go that far. And so, of course, we didn't prepare. We didn't have protection, and, like, it turned into this whole dramatic situation, which, probably colored our off and on relationship for the next however many years we were together. It allows you to create toxic relationships, I think, because no one is telling you, like, oh, it's okay to feel this way. It's okay for this to happen. It's natural for humans to express their sexuality. Like, this is how people and the world of things replicate themselves, right? There was so much I had to unlearn about, human relationships and sexuality. I guess the other quote unquote bad stuff or negative stuff that I still think about is just the indoctrination, like the constant, you go to chapel in the morning, you go to Bible class at some point during the day, you go to chapel at night, you have Vespers on Friday night, you got church on Saturday, you got Eventide at Saturday night. I mean, it's just church, 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 church. And it was never anyone ever asking about what you actually thought. It was like, this is what you need to, this is the way it is. And how come you aren't more on fire for Jesus than you are?
Right. Wow. I'm so glad you shared these last anecdotes, because right now, and I'm going to ask you a little bit more about this later, recently Ted Wilson announced what he called a human sexuality task force, because apparently the Adventist Church in North America and Europe and some other places is becoming too LGBTQ affirming, and people roasted this announcement on Twitter. Candidly, I was one of them too, because
I mean, just think about the name, Human Sexuality Task Force. What like, what absurdist, speculative fiction are we living in where someone actually thinks that that's a good name for something?
yeah, I don't, yeah, that was my thoughts exactly. The first thing I thought, I was like, well, this sounds kind of dystopian. And so anyway, I bring that up. We're going to come back to that later, but I bring that up to make the point that sex is such a point of contention and shame and secrecy, at least within my own experience within the Adventist Church. So many people felt like they couldn't talk about it. I've spoken to ex-Adventists who did actually get some decent sex education. They learned about contraceptives and protection and condoms and things like that. But I've also heard from ex-Adventists who never, ever said a word or heard a word from their parents about sex. Somebody shared a story with me where they grew up having a mom who was a nurse, and they found out about sex through her medical textbooks, but she never once told them anything. And when she found out that as a 14-ish something-year-old kid, they found out about sex through their medical textbooks, she took all the textbooks out the very next day. And she was upset that they had learned about human anatomy and reproduction through her medical textbooks. And I'm like, how can you be a medical professional and you won't talk to your kid about sex? So I'm wondering, for you, in the family you grew up in the community you grew up in, what was that like? Did you ever have the talk at boarding school? Did you ever have any sort of sex ed or anything like that?
Well, we should note that the co-founder of the Adventist Church, i.e. Ellen White, her first book was called An Appeal to Mothers. And it was about how practicing secret vice, i.e. masturbation, would create all these problems, early death, blindness, blah, blah, like total and absolute fiction, right?
Yeah.
But also nobody ever talks about that. Like, I didn't know that book existed as a kid. And like a dyed-in-the-wool Adventist will probably be like, well, it might sound a little extreme, but she's really onto something, because if you get into that, if you practice that and blah, 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 and it's like, no, actually it's fine. Just chill.
Not only her, but also John Harvey Kellogg. I loved the fact that I found out about your your great-grandfather's diploma being signed by him. Because, if you have any interest, episode 4, I do a whole deep dive into John Harvey Kellogg, and not only him, but before him, Sylvester Graham.
Absolutely.
Not only is it cornflakes that have this tie to this, but graham crackers
I know.
have a tie to this.
I know. So my parents were, I never felt like they were repressed in that way as much as they maybe. I remember what happened was, like, I had these two girls in my church, and their names were Raylene and Jolene. They had a trampoline, and they lived in this part of town called Happy Top, which was not happy. It was very poor. There were trailers. There were just rundown houses. But I loved hanging out with Raylene and Jolene. They were great. We watched Scooby-Doo together. We ran around. We were on their trampoline. And Adventist kids to me are like this combination of like really judgy, really critical, but also really transgressive. You could just like spin a wheel and get one of those, and we just happened to be feeling transgressive apparently, because we were on the trampoline and we were just like ecstatic, like, yeah. And so we just started yelling the bad words that we knew. And so I was yelling shit, because that was the only bad word that I knew. But Raylene was yelling fuck. And her mom came out and she grabbed her off the trampoline and took her back into the house and spanked her. And I was like waiting in the living room for my parents. I was probably there because my parents were doing something else and they needed someone to watch me. And Raylene's mom comes into the living room and says, "Do you know what that word means?" And I'm thinking in my head, shit, like, I think it means poop, but I didn't say that. She goes, "Well, it means making love. Do you know what making love is?" And I was like, yeah, of course I do. Like, everyone knows what love is and how to make it. You just like, you naturally love someone. And I remember my dad giving me the talk on the way home. I guess she told him the whole story. And my first thought was like, wait, that's what people in the Bible did? like Zechariah? Like when he was too old to have and he was like, and Elizabeth, like, but God just let him have a baby. He's like, they actually like pulled up their robes and, put their parts together. It was just like mind blowing. Right. And we also had this, book that was like, it was called Where Did I Come From? And it was drawings, it was cartoons. And so it showed like, it was like this couple that was like slightly overweight and middle-aged, but as a cartoon. And it was like, this is a man and he has a penis, and this is a woman and she has breasts and she has a vagina. And when the guy gets, aroused, he puts his penis in her vagina. His penis gets big and he goes, and like, it was like, and it like was illustrating it. And then it like had little cartoon sperm with like top hats on. And what? It was just like, I remember my dad sat me down and he like read the whole thing to me, and it was just like, and I think that they were pretty open about like stuff like, it wasn't like a, daily topic of conversation or anything, but I never felt like I couldn't ask them a question. Not that I would. But like my memories aren't of my parents being like super repressive or anything like that, That's
good to hear. My story of the talk is not nearly as dramatic. I've recorded that before, so I won't rehash it here, but suffice to say that I got a VHS tape from like the 70s or 80s.
Oh, wow.
And that was interesting. All right, so I want to fast forward, and based on your bio, it looks like you didn't attend any Adventist colleges. And if so, I'm wondering why that was, and if you had any disagreements with your family about where you went to college.
Actually, I did the first 2 years I attended Adventist colleges. I went to Andrews with the girlfriend for my senior year, and it was probably the most dismal, depressing time of my life because I was stuck in a dorm in the middle of nowhere, didn't have a car, didn't see the sun, like every form of precipitation that Lake Michigan's lake effect could have upon Berrien Springs. I mean, I felt like we didn't see the sun for 3 months. And I was only there for a quarter. And one of the reasons I'd gone there was one of my good friends, Todd Wimmer. He's a journalism professor at Endicott College now in Massachusetts. He had gone there with my friend Scott, who had been my roommate, and they were 2 years ahead of me in boarding school. And they talked about how awesome Andrews was and how great the people were. I didn't find that to be the case, but Todd, in between going to Andrews and going to AUC, where he was when I was at Andrews, had gone to Newbold and had met someone who was going to AUC. So he went to AUC, and then he called me up and he was like, you should transfer here. The English department is amazing. And at that time, like, the English department was like if you were going to be an English major as an Adventist, you went to AUC. So I transferred there, and it was incredible. I mean, I read Faulkner and Plath and T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf and Kant and David Hume and, like, philosophers and just, it was just like, my brain was on fire. I started smoking some weed and got drunk and I had all these experiences where I was, took mushrooms, right? And then like the kids that I had who were my best friends graduated, and I had like 2 more years there, and I didn't want to stay there. And my friend from elementary school, Tom Sitters, was like, hey, I want to go to UNC. You should come be my roommate and we'll go to UNC together. And I was like, well, all my friends are leaving, so and I could actually study with real writers, right? Like writers who aren't just publishing in Spectrum or, the Adventist Review or wherever. So I transferred, talked my parents into doing it. It was I think, my tuition at AUC at that time might have been $15,000 a year, whereas at UNC it was like $2,000 or $2,500.
Real quick, just to clarify, AUC stands for...
Oh, yeah, Atlantic Union College. It's in South Lancaster. It's now defunct. It closed down years ago, but it was also the place where I had where I taught for the first time after I got my master's. But anyway, the only person I remember having an issue with me going to UNC was Ted. We were at dinner somewhere, and when he found out that I was going to UNC, he just said, I can't imagine why you would do that. What could it possibly have that an Adventist school couldn't provide? And the answer to that was a hell of a lot, because as an English major, I had a lot of electives. And so I ended up taking classes that I was interested, like I took a class on Taoism, on Japanese literature, on mythology, and it was just like a banquet for the intellect, right? I had all these amazing teachers and amazing classmates and amazing materials, and even my English classes, I was like, damn, these motherfuckers in the 17th century were high on God, man. In ways that, like Adventists certainly weren't.
Yeah. And it's so funny to hear that Ted would ask you, what can you find at a secular school that you can't find at an Adventist school? Abby and Amy did an episode on fiction and Adventist attitudes toward fiction, and how Ellen White was very anti-fiction. So, of course, if you're going to be interested in literature, if you're going to be an English major, I got to imagine, at least in some Adventist schools when you were going to college, there was like you said, a hell of a lot that you could find at a non-Adventist school.
Well, and it's funny because Audley Stafford was this like lauded professor at AUC, and so many Adventist English majors who went through the English department at AUC will credit her for, I mean, transforming their lives, making them appreciate reading and literature. And she was very liberal, but she was still Adventist, and she was best friends with my grandmother when they were going through AUC. And she loved my grandmother. She's like, "Oh, your grandmother, I loved her so much." And then when I would bring up Audley Stafford to my grandmother, she would go, "Dear me, she was just so critical." Because Dr. Stafford was this intellectually fierce woman who was very much a feminist, and really didn't like the fact that she had to work twice as hard to earn half as much, and on and on and on. My dad's older brother Don, who is known as one of the members of the Wedgwood Trio, which was like the Adventist Grateful Dead. He was also an English major, and he's like one of my favorite people because he's so not judgmental. He was an Adventist pastor for years. He's retired now, but you could tell him anything, and he would find a way to talk to you about the validity of whatever your response was. He wouldn't try to shame you. And I think that his nuance, which is greater than my own father's, I think, because when This World Is Not Your Home came out, one of my dad's reactions was, "Do people really want to hear about you masturbating?" And it was just because I had a line in there in the boarding school essay where it was like, I was like, "Oh my God, I jacked off again." And now, if I'm not forgiven for it, my mom's going to see it on the cosmic screen of,
oh God,
like in the afterlife of like why your son isn't in heaven.
Yeah,
because he couldn't stop touching himself. And my dad was like his whole thing. It was like literally like 2 sentences in a whole book, right? Do people really want to read about you masturbating? I was like, of course not, but that's not the point, right? But my uncle, while we were having the conversation, he called and said, "I just want you to know that me and Melinda, his wife, we're reading your book, and we just think you've done a wonderful job. We don't agree with everything you have to say about Adventism, but you really paint it with warmth and tenderness and nuance, and I just want you to know that we appreciate that." And I was like, "In your face, Dad," because your older brother, who's a pastor, just said that it was okay. Now, I don't know. Ted would definitely not think it was okay. I love Ted as a person. He is kind. He's funny. There's a lot to unpack and to get into and argue with and dislike about his theology. Absolutely, he's been very kind to me, and so there's that too, which is just it's weird to think, because I often tell Elijah, my son, I said, Uncle Ted, and he was like, he's the most famous person that nobody knows about.
Yeah. Yep. It's so interesting how the Adventist Church is bigger, apparently, in membership size than the Mormon Church, but virtually nobody knows about Adventism unless
you're in it.
Yeah, exactly. I've joked with a previous podcast guest about how there needs to be an Adventist Book of Mormon. One of my earlier guests, Jeff, had actually talked about having that conversation with some of his Adventist friends who are still Adventist, but I guess more open-minded. And I guess one of them had brought that idea up to him, and I'm like, yeah, they're definitely, I could absolutely see a musical being made.
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, it would have to include like The Sound of Music, because for whatever reason, I don't know if this has been your experience, but definitely in my experience, like if there's one movie that every Adventist seen and adores, it's The Sound of Music. And I think it's partly like there was a English professor at Andrews who wrote, and it was probably published in Spectrum, this essay about how one of the reasons for that is probably because at the end of the movie, when the Nazis are chasing down the Von Trapp family, there are echoes of Time of Trouble, right? Mm-hmm. Anyway, yeah, I would love to see and be a part of creating an Adventist musical, because it would also include stuff like, getting your auto reverse Walkman to place tapes backwards and hear Stairway to Heaven and Robert Plant singing "My Sweet Satan."
Yeah,
music is such a huge part of Adventist life,
100%. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because my mom, she was not born in the U.S. She's Latina. She immigrated as an adult, and she converted to Adventism as a teenager in her home country. I don't know when she was introduced to it, how she heard about it, but she absolutely loves The Sound of Music. And I remember watching that movie with her multiple times, and how she just loved it so much. One of the things I've talked about is how I'm still, as an adult now, as an ex-Adventist, trying to reconnect with my cultural heritage through my mom, that she, I think, after leaving her home country and after becoming Adventist, didn't really identify with that much. And so I feel like there's this kind of gap in my story of who I am as a person that I'm trying to reconnect with. But she identified so much with Adventist culture and with The Sound of Music and things like
funny?
that.
Because is there any movie whiter than The Sound of Music, right?
Exactly. And we're going to pause here. Stay tuned for part 2 of my conversation with Matthew. We talked about how he eventually left Adventism, finding his current worldview, his new book, and much more, including his uncle, Ted Wilson, and the recently announced Human Sexuality Task Force. You won't want to miss it. So if you haven't already subscribed on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, follow the show today, and please leave a like, comment, or a rating, especially if you're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, as that helps more people find the show. Don't forget to see the show notes for links to all the books and topics we've discussed, and please consider donating to support the show. Thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks for listening. If you have a story to share about your Adventist or Fundamentalist experience, we'd love to hear it. You can submit stories on our website at hell.bio. That's HELL.bio. Or leave us a voicemail at 301-750-8648, and we might feature it in a future episode. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you on the next one.